and explain something that is relatively complicated. I think you should watch this through once, try and follow the key ideas, and then maybe watch it through again, pausing and perhaps making notes on the key things as you go. So the topic is the party and the state, and this is something that often confuses people because we're not used to making a really clear distinction between party and state all the time. So the easiest way to get your head around it to begin with is to just think about the 21st century and think about a situation that you understand and that you know. So the distinction I want to try to make is between political parties and the state. And the first thing to say is that the state always exists, at least in modern countries. The state always exists. It might change slightly, it might evolve, you might get new laws being passed, you might even get a new constitution being written, but the state by and large always exists in one form or another. Political parties come and go. New political parties can be formed. Political parties can disappear. They can become defunct. They can become more popular or less popular. But they are temporary, whereas the state is permanent. Another way of thinking about this is that the state employs civil servants. The state employs people who are servants of civil society. I'm talking about people like policemen, prison workers, judges, but also teachers, people who serve in the army, doctors, nurses, and so on. They are all employees of the state in one form or another. The civil servants will be employed by the state regardless of which political party is in power. The state also runs elections. It's built into the machinery of the state, into the infrastructure of a modern democratic state, to run elections every so often, and there are laws and rules in the constitution which set out how often those elections will happen. The political parties will compete for the right to form the government. And there's a third term which I haven't got on screen there, but the political parties, if they win an election, will form the government. So let's say, for example, there's been an election and one party has won the election and therefore has the right to form the government. That party therefore has the right, has the authority to direct the operations of the state for a fixed term. The other political parties don't disappear. They don't become necessarily any less important. In fact, they still have a very important job to play, but for a short time, one party is in charge of directing the operations of the state. But after a subsequent election, that party may lose power and another political party will come along to direct the affairs of the state. Just so we provide a little bit more detail, and this is one of the slides you might want to pause on later, there are some similarities between the party and the state in terms of the way they organise themselves and the way they are arranged, but they have quite different aims, generally speaking, quite different purposes, generally speaking, and they operate in different ways. So even if one party is in charge of the state, it retains all of those aims and roles down the left-hand side, as well as finding itself all of a sudden responsible for those roles down the right-hand side. One other way of explaining this is by comparing what these two different organisations are interested in and what they're responsible for. So this is a screenshot from the Labour Party website. You can see that objective number one is to elect people into Parliament. So their primary aim is getting people into power. How are they organised? Well, you can see down there highlighted in the purple boxes, they've got local levels, they've got regional levels, and then they've got national levels. Now, the New Zealand government is a national organisation. There are regional councils and regional governments and regional district boards and so on, but the national government is a national organisation. And you can see at the moment, what's the New Zealand government responsible for? Well, it's responsible for protecting the citizens of the country. Now, at the moment, it's the Labour Party who have responsibility for organising that, but they are working with elected officials. So the Director General of Health is high profile at the moment. You've probably seen him on the TV, and it's his job to make sure that everybody stays safe and well. And in order to do that, he's working with members of the Labour Party. But if there was an election tomorrow and a new government came along, then he would have to continue doing his job, but just work with different people while he did it. Also have a look at the things that the New Zealand government is interested in, the things that it concerns itself with. And if a party is not in power, they may well have policies on those things, but they're not responsible for making sure that they run properly. Having said that, look at the list, and this is just the first few things on the A to Z of the New Zealand government website. A party that's in power finds itself all of a sudden responsible for directing the operations of all of these things. A party that's not in power might have opinions about them, might have policies on them, but isn't responsible for directing them. Right, let's think about Russia after the Russian Revolution. When Lenin came to power, he found himself in charge of a state which didn't really exist. The Bolshevik state, the communist state, inherited what was left over of the old imperial state, but the old imperial Russian state had largely fallen to pieces during the last few years of Tsar Nicholas's reign. And as you probably already know, Lenin struggled to get the old institutions of the old imperial state to take any notice of him because they refused to recognize his legitimacy as leader. Now, the Bolsheviks had support all over the country. Those little red dots, you might need to pause this, those little red dots are all of the places where there were major strikes or major centers of Bolshevik support in 1917 and early 1918. And on these maps, it's the same map, you've just got an enlargement on the right hand side. Those black dots inside the circles, those are centers where there were Bolshevik centers of power, Bolshevik Soviets, or rather Soviets under Bolshevik control by March 1918. So the Bolsheviks had some power, they had some support, and that power was largely in organizations called the Soviets. Now, it's important to remind yourselves what the word Soviet means in Russian. It just means council. So, if you're Lenin, where is your state power going to come from? Well, some of it's going to come from what's left of the old imperial state, and some of it's going to come from the Soviets. The imperial state has the infrastructure, but not necessarily very efficient infrastructure, and the Soviets have huge people power, but not necessarily any other kinds of power. Now, one of the things that happened during 1917 and into 1918 is something known as the Bolshevization of the Soviets. In other words, these Soviets, these councils which had sprung up in 1917, gradually became Bolshevized. In other words, the number of Bolsheviks on those Soviets increased, and the number of non-Bolsheviks decreased as the Bolsheviks gradually pushed out the non-Bolsheviks. So sometimes this happened spontaneously through popular support for the Bolsheviks, and some revisionist historians would argue that this was a natural process as the Bolsheviks became more popular. Other historians, more traditional historians, would argue that this is actually a symptom of Lenin and the Bolsheviks using more and more force to get rid of their opposition. Either way, what's definitely true is that the Bolsheviks gained control of the Soviets across Russia. So we know how the Bolsheviks gained control of the imperial state. They did it partly through threats, coercion, and partly at gunpoint. They also gained control of the Soviets as they Bolshevized the membership of these Soviets. So this is one way in which the power of the political party, the political Bolshevik party, gained control over the infrastructure of the state. And so we get to this diagram, which is in your booklet. Now, it's well worth getting to grips with this booklet. I'm going to talk through the different ways you need to think about it shortly. You don't need to memorize everything on here, but you do need to know certain key things about it. One of the key things is that in the Soviet Union, there was a Communist Party and there was a Soviet government. So just like in 21st century New Zealand, there was a party system and a state system, but there are some pretty important differences. There were elections in the Soviet Union, just like there are in New Zealand in the 21st century, but there are some pretty important differences. So you still have a party system and a state system, but in the Soviet Union, there's only one party, which is why we call the Soviet Union a one-party state. Sometimes you might even shorten that and hyphenate party state to emphasize the fact that there is only one party. Now, the party and the state have similar ways of organizing themselves, just like parties and states do in the modern world. But the key thing, the one thing that I want you to understand is this. Between 1919 and 1922, real power shifted from the state to the party. So you might remember that one of Lenin's first acts in 1917 was to create a new government, to create Sovnarkom, the Council of People's Commissars. And it's Sovnarkom that issues the first few decrees, and it's using Sovnarkom that Lenin began the Soviet state. But by 1919, the Politburo had been created, and the Politburo was a party organization. And between 1919 and 1922, actually, power shifted. It happened gradually, and it would have been obvious to some people, but not so obvious to other people at the time. But with hindsight, it's clear that by 1922, the really powerful organization is the Communist Party. Now, of course, the Communist Party used the state to get what it wanted. The Communist Party always relied on the power of the state. But the key thing to understand is that it's the people in the Communist Party who are making the key decisions. Okay, let's go on. At the next level, the local parties, looking at the left-hand side, would be used as recruiting grounds for the city and provincial parties. So in other words, if you're the city party, if you're in the Moscow Communist Party and you have a vacancy, where would you look for new recruits? Well, you'd go to the local parties and see who was good and recruit them. So you might join the local party yourself, and if you do a good job, you might find yourself promoted to one of the bigger cities or one of the regional parties. One thing that's noteworthy here, that third bullet point there, is that often if you do a really good job in a big party organization, this could be a direct route into the Politburo. Have a look across at the Soviet side, the city and provincial Soviets. There's no such way to leapfrog a stage from the Soviets. So if you're a member of the party, if you're in a big city or a big provincial office, you can accelerate your career pretty quickly. If you're a member of the local Soviet or the city Soviet, there's no such way to get promotion. Now, every year or so, the party would have a congress, and there would be an all-Russian Congress of Soviets. Imagine a big meeting, a big conference. Of these two, the party congresses are the key ones. The party congresses are the ones where policy is debated, where really important decisions are taken, where important votes get made, and where you can get yourself elected onto a higher party organization. At the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, really the job of that organization is just to rubber stamp the decisions of another organization. So there's very little decision-making power in those all-Russian congresses of Soviets. And right at the top of these two organizations, you can see Sovnarkom on the right. This is where Lenin started the Soviet government. This is the origin of the Soviet government. You can see Council of People's Commissars, 15 to 20 members. The commissars are managers of the departments of the government. So these are the equivalent of government ministers, cabinet ministers. And in the early days, this was the key decision-making body. But it increasingly lost power. It became a bit too big. Lenin found during the Civil War that listening to 15 or 20 people took too long. Decisions were complex and difficult, and so he needed a smaller organization. So he created the Politburo. And crucially, this was a Communist Party organization because he didn't want non-communists having any authority, any power, any input into these decisions. So you can see the Politburo is a much smaller organization, and these people ran the party, and effectively they ran the country from about 1919 onwards. You can see there are other organizations there. The Org Bureau is important to know about, and crucially, especially when we get to Stalin, the Secretariat is important as well. Just a few points about these organizations. Let's start in the top left, the Politburo. So way to remember this is that Polit sounds a bit like policy. This is the Policy Bureau. This is the organization that makes the key decisions on policy. So what are we going to do? This is the executive decision-making body. Now that's a bit like the Central Committee, the Central Executive Committee in the bottom right-hand corner, but the difference is that these people in the Politburo are much, much more senior, and there are very, very few of them. So the Central Committee make their decisions really by debating and by voting, but as time goes by, they get less important things to debate, less important things to vote on. The Politburo make the key decisions, the Central Committee make the less important decisions as time goes by. So the Politburo decide policy, they're the policy-making body. The Central Executive Committee make the executive decisions. The Org Bureau, bottom left, are the Organisation Bureau. So when the Central Committee is not meeting, the Organisation Bureau take over, but their job really is to put policy into action. So once a policy has been decided either by the Central Committee or by the Politburo, they hand it to the Org Bureau, who decide how to make it happen. So these people are in contact with the ministries, with the local regional bodies of the party, and they are making things happen. But the Politburo and the Central Committee are the ones making the key decisions. The Secretariat might look unimportant, but as you'll find out when we get later on further into this topic, they are vitally important. So the Secretariat is a part of the party. It's a set of offices. It had its own building. In fact, Stalin took over a hotel in central Moscow and used it as the headquarters of the Secretariat. He was initially given 2 hotels, I think, but they were too far away from Lenin's offices, so he complained and got them moved and moved into one big hotel, and it became the Secretariat. So it's an organization in its own right, but it's part of the party. It's run by the General Secretary. So Stalin is the General Secretary, and that is obviously the head of the Secretariat. So the General Secretary, the General Secretary is in charge of the Secretariat. The Secretariat is an organization. The Secretariat's job is to do the admin, do the paperwork, do the the preparation for meetings, sending out agendas, making sure that the right people have been invited, keeping membership records for the entire Communist Party up to date, making sure that if somebody has broken the rules of the party, they get expelled, taking in new members when they decide that they're ready to do that. When there are party congresses and party conferences, making sure that the invitations get sent out to the right people, making sure that the local and regional and city and provincial bodies of the party send the right number of delegates to the congresses, making sure that there are hotel rooms for the delegates for those congresses, making sure that everybody who's coming to a congress knows when it starts and where the different meetings are going to be. Right? Doesn't sound very interesting, but turns out to be absolutely vitally important later on. So just to recap, the Central Committee make the decisions. They are the executive decision-making body. They're quite large. They, as time goes by, don't get to vote on anything particularly important, so they set the general direction. Anything that they decide goes to the Politburo, who increasingly just make decisions without talking to the Central Committee. But that's okay because these guys are the senior members of the party. So these guys are taking general decisions and turning them into policy. When they've decided what the policy is going to be, they hand that policy to the Organisation Bureau, the Org Bureau, and they make it happen. So we've got general decision to make something happen from the Central Committee, specific policy how it's going to work from the Politburo, and then the organisation and the making it happen from the Org Bureau. And then off to the side we have the Secretariat, who organise the administration of the party. So this is really just to illustrate power in the Communist Party state to finish off. This doesn't really prove which body was more important or more powerful, but it's an illustration. Just have a look and compare the names. Those people on the left-hand side in the Politburo by 1923, you've probably heard of most of those guys by this stage. But in Sovnarkom by 1923, how many of those people have you heard of? How many of those people are going to go on to be to play central roles in the Soviet state? Look at the people on the left and how many of them are also members of Sovnarkom. But how many of those less important members of Sovnarkom are creeping into the Politburo? The answer is not very many of them. So it's not proof, but it is an illustration. Hope that helps to clear up some of the complex points.